basically explain, Sebastian, your background, how you got into vaccines and what you do professionally?
So my background is, I'm an engineer. That's my background. So trained as a biotechnology and engineering degree in biotechnology from KTH, Royal Institute of Technology in Stockholm, and then I did my master's thesis on vaccine immunology in a group at the Karolinska Institute, and then I stayed on there to do a PhD. So I'm currently a PhD student, wrapping up, I guess.
Why do you think people, particularly people who are young, why should they get the coronavirus vaccine?
Well, a young person like us should
Yes.
think about maybe two aspects, right? There's like your individual, you as an individual, but also the community aspect. And as an individual, it's about reducing risks, right? And COVID, so coronavirus disease, is unpredictable, even in young people. You can develop severe disease even without underlying comorbidities, or you can even develop long COVID symptoms, right, which can be debilitating for many months. And vaccines don't give you that, right? So going through the natural infection, the infection of COVID, is unpredictable, and a vaccine gives you the same or even better immunity, but without any of those risks. So it's a win-win, basically, on an individual level. But then on a community level as well, we want to open back up society, we want to get back to some kind of normal, and then we need high vaccination rates. We need high levels of immunity within society to be able to open back up. So everybody that can should get vaccinated.
Do the risks of taking a vaccine outweigh any of its benefits?
Well, currently, none of the vaccines have any risk that would outweigh its benefits at all. The vaccines are highly efficacious, all of them, and they do protect you from ending up in hospital with COVID. So, and that far outweighs any of the risks that any of the vaccines have. And that goes for all of the vaccines, even the mRNA vaccines.
So, if you can explain the vaccine development and the speed and safety at which that was done.
No, that's a very good point. So, indeed, they have been developed in record time. We have never had a vaccine go from, design to some type of approval in under a year, right? That is unheard of for vaccines. But the actual underlying technology behind these vaccine platforms and these different vaccines is decades old. This type of genetic vaccines that deliver a genetic cargo, like the viral vectors and the mRNA vaccines, they started to come up already in the 90s. In the early 90s is when people started doing research on this. Academic research labs started looking into those types of platforms. So they've been around for at least 30 years. And a lot of the main breakthroughs have been done in the last 10, 15 years for these vaccine platforms. And that's why they were reaching their maturity when COVID came along. And that's why we could be so fast in making good vaccines. So all the processes were followed, definitely. All the clinical trials that were supposed to be run were run. Phase 1, Phase 2, Phase 3, all of that was run for all of the vaccines that have been approved for use. The main reason that it has been able to go much quicker than normal is that a lot of these trials could be run in parallel, or in a staggered manner, that you would run a Phase 1 trial until you reach the primary outcome, and once you know the primary outcome, you could already start the Phase 2 trial. In normal circumstances, you would wait out until the full Phase 1 trial is done, and that's usually up to a year. The main reason for doing that is also financial risks. That a lot of this is about vaccine companies taking big financial risks on testing medications, or in this case vaccines, in human participants. That costs a lot of money. So the funding that they've been able to receive from governments, footing the bill for the clinical trials, but also for the development, the scaling up of manufacturing, the building of new plants to manufacture the vaccines, all of that has been paid for by governments because they wanted to go quicker, and they want the vaccine companies to feel like they can take that risk because the risk is being covered by somebody else. And that is really why it's been able to go so fast. Of course, there's been a lot of basic research that has paved the way for these vaccine platforms to be able to even be considered as candidates for COVID, as vaccine candidates. But
can you explain immunity and, clarify some of the misconceptions that people might have about it?
Yeah, so I think for the general public, immunity, in terms of a word, for many means that you're protected. So it's like 100% protection, you're immune to something. But for a scientist, immunity is a spectrum, and it's actually a very big gradient. And if it's 100%, it's called sterilizing immunity. And it's very hard to get sterilizing immunity to anything. So when we speak about immunity, it's definitely a very big gradient, and that's why I would even recommend people that have had COVID before to get vaccinated. Because just because you've had it before doesn't mean you can't catch it again. Because your immunity, especially when it comes to having had the infection, the level of your immunity really depends on how severe that infection you had was. So if you ended up in the hospital, in the ICU, you might actually have developed pretty good immunity after that, because it has a lot to do with sort of like how long you're exposed to the virus and how hard your immune system had to fight to get rid of it. Your immune system forms memory, and memory is some sort of education that your immune cells have to go through. And when you get vaccinated, when you get reinfected, they basically get reschooled, and they get trained to identify that pathogen even better. So they develop basically better quality. So immunity is not only about quality, it's also about quantity. And that's why for many vaccines, you have to get a booster shot eventually, right?
Like tetanus.
Yeah, for many, you have to, within 3 years or 5 years or 10 years, you have to get a booster shot, because it has to do with magnitude. Eventually, the levels of your immune cells that you have that are specific to this pathogen, they end up at too low of a level that they're not protective anymore. So that's the quantity aspect. But then that extra immunization also has a quality aspect, and it improves how well your immune system can identify the pathogen and get rid of it quickly and effectively. So people shouldn't be scared of getting a third shot. Like, I think a lot of people are worried, or I've heard a lot of people say that, why should I get vaccinated if I will have to get a shot every year or something like that. I think that's a very minor inconvenience in the whole
Vaccines are like Botox, the more the merrier.
Yeah, to some extent, I
Yes.
guess. I think if we can think about it like this, the 2009 pandemic flu,
Yes.
it's still around.
Oh, okay.
So it's still a circulating virus. And there are local outbreaks of it. It has ended up being some kind of the seasonal flu now, right? In India, they still have cases of the 2009 swine flu.
Herd immunity, and everyone thinks there's a magic number when it comes to that and stuff.
So yeah, if we take herd immunity first, yes, I think reaching this magical number, it's not gonna eradicate this coronavirus. It's gonna be around for a long time, most likely. It might even end up being one of the endemic human coronaviruses of the future, right? That causes a seasonal epidemics. But
are they effective against death? All of them. I mean, I think the Chinese vaccines, they said that they were 100%. I don't know if that's possible.
I think all vaccines so far, even the ones that have had lower efficacy against mild disease, all of them have protected very, very well against death and serious complications, hospitalization. That being said, there will still be a few cases of people dying even if they've been vaccinated. And that is because it can never be 100%. It can be 100% in a 40,000 participant trial, but when you get to hundreds of millions of people, one person dying then is less than, it's a very, very small fraction of a percent. So the important thing to think about with the vaccines, and the important message about the vaccines, is that yes, that even though they might have different efficacies when it comes to protection against mild disease, they all pretty much have very similar high efficacy against hospitalization and death. So they're great vaccines, and that's the important thing, right? None of us want to end up, if we get COVID, we don't want to end up in the hospital.
As more people get vaccinated and we reach, a certain stage where the majority of the population is vaccinated, will non-pharmaceutical measures still play a role in that? Wearing masks, social distancing? Can we do this with vaccines alone?
Until we get very, very high levels of vaccination coverage, we still need both. But once we reach a very high level of vaccine coverage, then hopefully we can let go of some of these non-pharmaceutical interventions. But I think to a large extent they've been great not only against COVID but for many other diseases, yes. Right? We didn't have a flu season last year, we didn't have an RSV season, when many of these respiratory pathogens didn't cause big outbreaks last year because of these non-pharmaceutical interventions. So I think some level of social distancing, some level of mask wearing and more washing of hands and all of this kind of mindset to being in public spaces, I think is important going forward. But I think I definitely hope we can avoid the use of lockdowns and very strict restrictions and isolation procedures. I think to some extent, I think those hopefully are behind us, and that we can sort of fight these with more mild restrictions.
The Swedish way.
The Swedish way in some extent, yeah, I guess.